Retracing the joint careers of Gilbert and Sullivan in the 1870s, while labouring under the California sun in the 1980s, is an exercise not without its advantages. For one thing, it convinces the researcher, if he ever doubted it, that the Savoy operas are universal as well as timeless, and that Los Angeles knows just as much about them as London does, provided you know where to look. In talking to Dr Thomas Heric, the memorabilia surrounds us. Quaint survivals from an age so remote from this one, and yet really only just around the corner. When Gilbert and Sullivan were evolving their working partnership, the state of California was still a new world, recovering from the shock waves of the Great Gold Rush, and only just beginning to attract the American Civil War veterans moving west on the newfangled Transcontinental Railroad. A century passes, and the sentimental garlands of Savoy first night programmes, the fine flourish of Gilbertian and Sullivanesque signatures scrawled across yellowing notepaper, long vanished faces looking out from faded photographs, all this has come to rest in Los Angeles, where Tom Heric preserves it all with loving care. The distance of Los Angeles from the source of Gilbert and Sullivan has been no impediment to Tom in his quest for material, and he stands high among that tiny group of explorers who have gone out into the world searching for Thespis. Tom never found it, neither has anybody else. Perhaps it doesn't exist anymore. Maybe some unwitting stage manager at J.C. Toole's old bandbox theatre at Charing Cross mistook the music of Thespis for some old band parts for one of those transient curtain raisers that nobody would ever need again, and threw the lot into the dustbin. Or maybe the band parts did survive until a few years later Toole's little theatre was knocked down to make way for the new Charing Cross Hospital. Maybe those band parts are lying there to this day, deep under the foundations of the hospital. However, with the second of the Gilbert and Sullivan collaborations, Trial by Jury, the researcher suddenly finds himself out in the open. To move from Thespis to Trial by Jury is like coming out of a dark tunnel into the bright light of verifiable certainties.
The theatre that it was performed in was owned by one Miss Deloro, and D'Oyly Carte was working for her. And he was a very clever fellow, D'Oyly Carte. He'd produced a couple of operas on his own, or at least had written them, and they were performed, but not very successfully. And he'd given up writing and decided to try his hand at producing. They were showing Offenbach, Pericole, and it was too short. You got to remember Victorian tastes where you went to the theater after dinner and you stayed there till late at night. They make our modern television viewing paltry. Gilbert and Sullivan were approached to write just a little piece as a filler to go in after Pericole. Again, the hard part was snaring Sullivan, all the more so after the failure of Thespis, or at least the perceived failure of it. Gilbert was ready to write it, and he did write it, lifting it largely from one of the Fun magazine poems that he had written. Naturally, it was lengthened, and a plot was added, but basically the same idea.
April the 11th, 1868. The Fun magazine. Trial by Jury by W.S. Gilbert. Attorneys are we, and we pocket our fee, singing so merrily trial by law, with our merry sa-sa and our jolly fi-fa, worshipping verily trial by law.
The text of that Fun article runs almost exactly parallel to the libretto which Gilbert adapted 7 years later. For example, the speech by counsel.
With a sense of deep emotion I approach this painful case, for I never had a notion that a man could be so base, or deceive a girl confiding vows, etc. deriding.
With a sense of deep emotion I approach this painful case, for I never had a notion that a man could be so base. Oh, deceive a girl confiding vows, etc. deriding. Interesting client, victim of a heartless wile. See the traitor of defiant, wear a supercilious smile. Sweetly smile my client on him, coyly good and gently won him. Sweetly smile his client on him,
Now, how did this startling transmutation from doggerel to operetta take place? Well, one day, early in 1875, the manager of the Royalty Theatre, Dean Street, Soho, bumped into Gilbert in the street. The manager's name was Richard Doyley Cart, and he was perhaps the first man in London to guess that a professional marriage between Gilbert and Sullivan would be worth a fortune, provided somebody could contrive to get them to the altar. Well, that man was Cart. Knowing that Gilbert had almost committed himself recently to a musical adaptation of Trial by Jury with a score by Carl Rosa, a plan that had foundered with the death of Mrs. Rosa, Cart suggested Sullivan as a new composer for the piece. And so, on a midwinter morning, with the snow fluttering down, Gilbert, huddled inside the fortress of a vast fur coat, went round to Sullivan's house and read him the libretto of the new operetta.
When I, good friends, was called to the bar, I had an appetite fresh and hearty, but I was, as many young barristers are, an impecunious party. I had a swallowtail coat of a beautiful blue, a brief which I bore to the booby, a couple of shirts and a collar or two, and a ring that looked like a ruby.
Gilbert came to my rooms and read it to me in a perturbed sort of a way, with a gradual crescendo of indignation in the manner of a man considerably disappointed with what he'd written. As soon as he'd come to the last word, he closed up the manuscript violently, apparently unconscious of the fact that I was screaming with laughter the whole time.
Oh, yes, I'm a judge, and a good judge, too. Though homeward, as you trudge, you declare my law is fudge, yet of beauty I'm a judge, and a good judge, too.
Sullivan found himself quite caught up in it, especially when he learned he was to make a little money. I don't mean to make him sound venal, but you have to understand that writing serious music would pay you 50, 100 pounds, but that didn't last very long, and it takes a long time to write a symphony or a cantata. So here was something he could write really quick, that he could get a royalty on, and he enjoyed doing it.
Oh, joy unbounded with wells surrounded, the bell is sounded of grief and woe.
With love devoted, on throne is doted, to castle moated, away they go.
I wonder whether they live together in marriage tether, in manner true.
It seems to me, sir, of such as he, sir, a judge is he, sir, and a good judge too. Oh,
It seems to me, sir, of such as she, sir, a judge is he, sir, and a good judge too. It seems to me, sir, of such as she, sir, a judge is he, sir, and a good judge too. Yes, I am a judge. Yes, I am a judge. Though homeward as you trudge, you declare my law is fudge, and of beauty I'm a judge. Though defendant is a snob, though defendant is a snob, though defendant is a snob, his only crown is one. So is Edward with a job and a good
by jury by Messrs. W.S. Gilbert and Arthur Sullivan is a pleasant addition to the bill of fare at Madame de Laro's Pretty Theatre in Soho. Its success last night, when Mr. Sullivan directed the orchestra, and he and his colleague were summoned at the descent of the curtain, was thoroughly genuine.
Gilbert was very fond of this operetta and appeared in it himself, mainly at charity performances. There is a non-speaking part, the associate, who sits right in front of the judge's bench and who works a quill, and Gilbert would play this part.
Do you think this business of a judge or the chancellor having an eye for young ladies, is there a germ of reality there? Do you think he might have come across a judge? I just wonder if there was some basis in fact.
Well, this theme runs through of inappropriate couples. The jailer and yeoman of the guard who's never going to win the young girl. The Lord Chancellor who wants to marry his ward, Phyllis. And again, the judge in trial by jury. I'm not so sure that Gilbert had a specific reason to attack this. I think it was a funny situation, which perhaps is a little cruel, but he exploited it. It's interesting, too, that Sullivan's brother was the original judge, and it was hoped, and at least the reviews of the time indicated that Sullivan's brother was well on his way to a career as a humorist, as a major player. Then when he became ill, notices went out, and the actual trial by jury was canceled several times because of this.
Isn't it ironic that Fred Sullivan, whose reputation as a comedian was just beginning, was in the end the subject of one of the most lachrymose, tearful, sentimental, I don't know what you would call it, hymns of grief throughout the 19th century. And I have a sneaking suspicion that the lost chord is no longer received quite in the spirit that Sullivan intended. Isn't there a cynical smile on posterity's face about the lost chord, as if we can't take its sentimentality seriously?
The publishers still report that it's still in print and it's still sold, and there are still recordings of it extant that are sold. So it's by no means dead. It was the largest bestseller of the Victorian era in terms of total sheet music sold for a single song. You're right, it is shamelessly sentimental, and yet it is moving if you listen to it and if you're in the right mood when you listen to it.
I was nursing my brother through a severe illness and had hardly left his bedside for several nights. Finding one evening that he had fallen into a doze, I crept into an adjoining room and tried to snatch a few minutes' rest. Finding this impossible, I aroused myself to work and made one more of many attempts over 4 years to set music to the words. This time, I felt the right inspiration, and there and then I composed the lost chord.
Seated one day at the organ, I was weary and ill at ease, and my fingers wandered idly over the noisy keys. I know not what I was playing, or what I was dreaming then, but I struck one chord of music like the sound of a great amen, like the sound of a great
Once trial by jury was established as something new in popular musical entertainment, D'Oyly Carte took steps to make the partnership binding. And very swiftly, the ethos of what we think of as the Savoy operas began to evolve. Thespis, the first collaboration between Gilbert and Sullivan, had been a mere Christmas squib. The trial by jury was a more concentrated attempt at synthesis, but it was still only a one-acter and a purely musical affair with no spoken dialogue at all. The genuine article began to have clear outlines with the third attempt, The Sorcerer, 2 acts and quite a lot of dialogue. And although the issue of Gilbert and Sullivan as an influence on other writers had hardly begun to exist yet, already there were the first rumblings of a problem which was to cause everybody involved with the Savoy productions a great amount of heartburn, the question of piracy. Now, the extent to which America was to become aware of what Gilbert and Sullivan were doing is demonstrated by the tributes that their lyricists of the generation following Gilbert's were to shower on their hero.
It goes on to modern day. One of my good friends is Dick Sherman, who wrote Chitty Chitty Bang Bang and It's a Small World After All. He's an avid Gilbert and Sullivan fan, and he loves to quote from Gilbert. So I think that people who are into literature and into music can't help but being seduced by Gilbert's lyrics. They're marvelous, and they fit so well.
It almost seems, if not absolutely, that if you're looking for evidence of the continuing tradition, you'd find it more in American writers than English. Because, I mean, P.G. Wodehouse was, of course, a Gilbert devotee, and there are signs that in Noel Coward's comic songs that he was too. But generally it's the American writers that have paid such handsome tribute to Gilbert. The people I'm thinking of are Ira Gershwin, who believed that the whole art that he practiced with such brilliance began with Gilbert, and that the source of everything is there, and Gilbert did it better than anybody else. And there are accounts of Cole Porter's early life where he said at Yale he was, I think I quote verbatim, crazy about Gilbert and Sullivan. And I once had conversations with Johnny Mercer on the same subject, and Mercer always used to begin the discussion with the same remark: I shared the same birthday as Gilbert. And he was so proud of that because he believed that Gilbert was the number one man in the craft. And I suppose the most handsome tribute of all is to imitate. And there is a marvellous example of this, unacknowledged, but I think with a twinkle in the eye. That song in The Sorcerer, which trades in a typically Gilbertian way with all the polysyllabic rhymes, nosology.
Yeah, the song of John Wellington Wells.
Yes, electrobiology, etc., etc. It's a very brilliant example of polysyllabic rhyme.
My name is John Wellington Wells. I'm a dealer in magic and spells, in blesses and curses and ever-filled purses, in prophecies, witches and elves. If you want a poker to make tracks, if you melt a rich uncle in wax, you've but to look in on the resident in number 70 Simmery X. We've a first-rate assortment of magic, and for raising a posthumous shade, with effects of the comic or tragic, there's no cheaper house in the trade. Love filter with quantities of it, and for knowledge if anyone burns, we're keeping a very small profit, a prophet who brings us unbounded returns. For he can prophesy with a wink of his eye, people security into futurity, sum up your history, clear up a mystery, humor proclivity for a nativity, for a nativity. Here's answers oracular, bogey spectacular, tetrapod tragical, mirrors too magical, facts astronomical, solemn comical, and if you want it, he makes a reduction on taking a quantity. Oh! If anyone anything lacks, he'll find it already in stacks, if he'd only look in on the resident in number 70 Simmery X.
Now that rhyme scheme and that vocabulary turns up, and I don't think any theatre critics at the time made a point of referring to it, 1943 I think it was. Cole Porter wrote a show in which the identical rhymes occur.
Let's talk about drugs. Let's talk about dope. Let's try to picture Paramount minus Bob Hope. Let's start a new dance. Let's try a new step. Or investigate the cause of Mrs. Roosevelt's pep. Why not discuss, my dearie, the life of Wallace Beery, or bring a Jeroboam on and write a drunken poem on astrology, mythology, geology, philology, pathology, psychology, electrophysiology, spermology, phrenology. I owe you an apology, but let's not talk about... Oh, in case you play cards, I have some right here. So how about a game of gin rummy, my dear? Or if you feel warm and bathing's your whim, let's get in the yacht together and enjoy a short swim. But honey, I suspect you all of being intellectual, and so instead of gushing on, let's have a big discussion on timidity, stupidity, solidity, frigidity, avidity, turbidity, Manhattan acidity, fatality, morality, legality, finality, neutrality, reality, or southern hospitality, pomposity, verbosity. I'm losing my velocity, but let's not talk about love.
Imitation is one thing, but piracy is quite another, and the history of Gilbert and Sullivan in America makes an extraordinary story. Not just because American impresarios stole the Savoy operas, but that they should wish to do so in the first place. As one of Gilbert's contemporaries once observed, Britain and America are two nations divided by a common language, and it might seem unlikely that dramatic works dealing with the more slapstick aspects of English political and social life should appeal to American audiences. On the contrary, so overwhelming was the appeal of the Savoy operas in the United States, and so rickety were the copyright arrangements of the day, that the temptation to pirate the operettas seemed too great for most American producers to resist.
Well, Thespis didn't get pirated, but Trial by Jury did. Within 6 months of it opening in London, there were productions in the United States, pirate productions. I think part of the reason for success was, again, the dearth of things in English for people to listen to. And we were used to hearing French operettas, things taken from other languages in other countries. Here was something that was distinctly English.
I would have thought that these operettas were so intrinsically English in style that any foreigner would have a trouble grasping the spirit of it. On the contrary, New York instantly took to them. And one reads of the problems that they had with people in New York sitting in the stalls, writing down the melodies, scribes transcribing the score, and then going off and producing pirated versions. And I know this was, of course, a disgraceful thing to do, but in a sense, I've always thought it reflected great credit on American sensibilities, because they knew instantly that these were special, different, original, entertaining works. Will I be right in saying that the American response was instantaneous? It didn't seem to come gradually. As soon as they heard it, they knew.
Well, after all, we don't have Lord Chancellors over here.
Exactly, yes.
We don't have a lot of these institutions, and yet they were things that interested us. Gilbert became very concerned at this when he did Princess Ida, which was the only 3-act Gilbert and Sullivan operetta. He was certain that Americans would have very little interest about an operetta written about British women's education. And yet, Princess Ida was a bigger success in the United States than it was in Britain.
This helmet, I suppose, was meant to ward off blows. It's very hot and weighs a lot, as many a guardsman knows, as many a guardsman knows, as many a guardsman knows, as many a guardsman knows. So off that helmet blows. Yes, 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 so off that helmet blows. This tight-fitting cuirass is but a useless mess. It's made of steel and weighs a deal. This tight-fitting cuirass is but a useless mess. A man is but an ass who fights in a cuirass. So off goes that cuirass. Yes, 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 so off goes that cuirass. These bracelets, truth to tell, may look uncommon well, but in a fight they're much too tight. They're like a lobster shell. They're like a lobster shell. Yes, 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 they're like a lobster shell. These things I treat the same. I quite forget their name. They turn one's legs to cleavage pegs. Their aid I thus disclaim. Their aid I thus disclaim. Though I forget their name, though I forget their name, their aid I thus disclaim. Yes, 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 their aid I thus disclaim.
The American craze for Gilbert and Sullivan became really big business with HMS Pinafore. And while that operetta was playing in London in the summer of 1878, Carte was in New York, attempting to do battle with the pirates of Broadway. He made no headway, And he even had to accept the freakish situation of the unauthorised versions making profits, while the legitimate production in London was not showing at all because of repairs to the theatre. And meanwhile in New York, chaos reigned, with some of the pirates evidently considering themselves less piratical than others. The news that Pinafore was the biggest London success that Gilbert and Sullivan had enjoyed so far caused these buccaneers of Broadway to fight among themselves for the palm of legitimacy in a most Gilbertian way.
With the taste of blood in their mouths, they pricked up their ears at news of further prey. They even quarrelled among themselves in advance as to the distribution of the booty. Some of these men were the managers of well-known theatres and in good standing in the profession, but the majority belonged to the class of penniless theatrical speculators who, in the expressive slang of the trade, are known as fly-by-nights. This union of classes, the worthy and the worthless, showed well the lamentable state of public opinion then existing as to the propriety of stealing other people's ideas without paying for them. In those days, even the newspapers laughed at such efforts to protect property in the courts, and in this way did much to salve the consciences of those managers who appeared to possess any.
Gilbert took the same view, really, I suppose, as his great hero Dickens on the question of copyright. I mean, Dickens, I know, had campaigned across America for some kind of copyright arrangement whereby American producers and publishers would have to pay a royalty to English works.
Gilbert didn't take up the cudgel as much as D'Oyly
Not as
Carte
much as
did.
Dickens.
D'Oyly Carte, though, went around and there was endless lawsuits. Maybe endless isn't the right word. There was at least a dozen in the United States trying to establish copyright for various Gilbert and Sullivan operettas. And Carte would win some and lose some. It was never firmly established. People continued to pirate, continued to be legal actions.
Well, when poor old Carte returned unsuccessful from New York in the summer of 1878, he realised that the next best thing to sinking the pirates would be to oppose them with the genuine article. And so, in November of that year, he sent Gilbert and Sullivan and their conductor, Alfred Sellier, over to New York, where they were interviewed by what were laughingly called the gentlemen of the press. Now, in their responses to the press, we can sense this curious distaste that both Gilbert and Sullivan had for doing this kind of work at all.
You must be very satisfied, Mr. Gilbert, to see Pinafore enjoying such a sensational success.
On the contrary, it is rather hard, when one has done serious work for years, to find that a frothing trifle like this should be as successful as it has been. We really had no idea, you know, that it would be as successful as it.
Are those your views too, Mr. Sullivan?
Absolutely. I confess I'm puzzled and disappointed that my oratorios have not met with the same acclaim that our comic operettas seem to inspire.
Under what influence was Pinafore composed? Champagne or Bass ale?
I'm afraid that while I was composing Pinafore, my serious illness imposed teetotalism upon me.
Did these memorable melodies come to you spontaneously, or did you have to search for them?
It's a great mistake to suppose that music bubbles up like a spring.
Some of it sounds like a bed spring.
And what of the words, Mr. Gilbert? How can it be that words are so closely wedded to the music, huh?
Well, Sullivan and I have a secret method. We work together.
Do you expect the words of Pinafore to become popular catchphrases?
Never. Well, let's say seldom. As to that, I think you better ask the ruler of the Queen's Navee.
Monarch of the sea, the ruler of the Queen's Navee, whose praise Great Britain loudly chants.
And we are his sisters and his cousins and his aunts.
And we are his sisters and his cousins and his aunts. His sisters and his cousins and his aunts. When at anchor here I ride, my bosom swells with pride, and I snap my fingers at the foeman's taunt.
And so do his sisters and his cousins and his aunts.
And so do his sisters and his cousins and his aunts. His sisters and his cousins and his aunts. But when the breezes blow, I
generally go below and seek the seclusion that a cabin grants.
And so Ulysses and his cousins and his aunts, and so Ulysses and his cousins and his aunts, and so Ulysses and his cousins and his aunts, Ulysses and his cousins and his aunts.
I served a term as office boy to an attorney's firm. I cleaned the windows and I swept the floor, and I polished up the handle of the big front door. I polished up that handle so carefully, but now I am the ruler of the Queen's Navy. I polished up that handle so carefully, but now he is the ruler of the Queen's Navy. As office boy, I made such a mark that they gave me the post of a junior clerk. I served the writs with a smile so bland, and I copied all the letters in a big round hand. I copied all the letters in a hand so free that now I am the ruler of the Queen's Navy. I copied all the letters in a hand so free that now he is the ruler of the Queen's Navy. In serving writs, I made such a name that an articled clerk I soon became. I wore clean clothes and a brand new suit for the pass examination at the Institute. That pass examination did so well for me that now I am the ruler of the Queen's Navy. That pass examination did so well for me that now he is the ruler of the Queen's Navy. Of legal knowledge I acquired such a grip that they took me into the partnership, and that junior partnership, I ween, was the only ship that I ever had seen. The only ship we ever had seen. But that kind of ship so suited me that I am the ruler of the Queen's Navy. But that kind of ship so suited me that now he is the ruler of the Queen's Navy. I grew so rich that I was sent by a pocket borough into Parliament. I always voted at my party's call, and I never thought of thinking for myself at all. I thought so little, they rewarded me by making me the ruler of the Queen's Navy. I thought so little, they rewarded me by making me the ruler of the Queen's Navy. Now, landsmen all, whoever you may be, if you want to rise to the top of the tree, if your soul isn't fettered to an office stool, be careful to be guided by this golden rule. Be careful to be guided by this golden rule. Stick close to your desks and never go to sea, and you all may be rulers of the Queen's Navy. Stick close to your desks and never go to sea, and you all may be rulers of the Queen's Navy.
Gilbert and Sullivan did license on 2 occasions I can think of American producers to produce their work. For the most part, though, D'Oyly Carte insisted on coming over here. At one point, he had 9 touring companies traveling all over the world. They went to Australia, New Zealand. They traveled all through the continent and through America, all the way from one coast to the other. I know of productions put on in Canada and in South America. So D'Oyly Carte spared no one. Transportation was a lot less expensive then, and he could mount up numbers of companies with scenery and props and send them out.
Have you ever come across stories or anecdotes or reminiscences where Americans did have trouble with any of the songs or the discrepancies in language, or did they just digest it lock, stock and barrel?
We did modify them, and so when you look back on Gilbert and Sullivan, you can see parodies in every jargon and dialect you want. Irish versions, Yiddish versions. I have 3 of the major operas all in Yiddish.
Muss pinseln mit der Augen, dem Maul verkrimmen, rein gut der Wanze so unsichtbar rimmen, schocklen mit dem Kopf und dem Bord abglätten, sie bloßen wie ein Endig in sich Covid geben. Sie bloßen wie ein Endig in sich Covid geben. Ihr müsst knacken mit den Fingern, euch drehen jeder Glied, und alle werden schreien nach Hochemayed. Ihr müsst knacken mit den Fingern, und euch drehen jeder Glied, und alle werden schreien nach Hochemayed.
There are 2 or 3 versions, a black Mikado, a cool Mikado, all using jazz music. And many times the words would be altered or changed to fit local situations, all again without the author's permission.
A wandering a minstrel, a thing of charrettes and patches of ballads, songs and snatches, a dreamy lullaby, a dreamy lullaby.
Something which struck me very forcibly in conversing with a Gilbert and Sullivan student as informed and dedicated as Tom Heric is that there can be a difference between American and British attitudes to the subject, a difference which I think has a lot to do with perspective. It's not exactly that distance lends enchantment, but it does sometimes give a clearer view of the scenery.
I have a theory about that. I think Britishers are spoiled in that they hear Gilbert and Sullivan when they're small, and they may associate it with infantile things or with their childhood, and it may be trite and banal to them. I think Americans approach this at an older age. They hear it as young adults or as teenagers or as adults, and it's fresh and novel to them. And I don't think that it carries with it the stigmata that British people have. I talk to Britons very often about this, and they say, oh, yes, that stuff, as though it is something infantile that they've put aside along with their teddy bear and their rocking horse.
There is a great deal of that feeling. It's quite childish. And also, over the years, a certain tendency to say, it's finished now. It's lived its usefulness, it's gone, it's done, and of course they're always made to look silly afterwards. But I found men of great acumen and good judgment laughing at Gilbert and Sullivan, saying, well, it was a rage for the time, but it's finished. I mean, I come across Arnold Bennett, who's a very shrewd man, saying in about 1921, I went to see a production of The Mikado, and I can't see that it's got any relevance. It's all gone, that kind of thing. And here we are 60 years later.
If you go out, as I did last year, to a local junior college, and you see a really enthusiastic cast of moderately talented people with tremendous spirit and enthusiasm, you can't help but get caught up in it and enjoy it. And the audience response is tremendous. So it speaks with a universal voice. When you talk about is it a craze or a rage, I don't know how long you have to last
yes,
to be a craze or a rage, but it certainly has lasted longer than 100 years.
Next week, the Savoy Theatre gets built, Oscar Wilde gets tangled up with what's showing there, and Gilbert, much to his own disgust, I think, became Sir William, the not-so-parfait knight of the English musical theatre.
Benny Green in company with Dr Thomas Heric talking about the careers of Gilbert and Sullivan. The actors taking part were Frederick Treeves, Bill Wallace, Ellen McIntosh, Roger Hammond and Peter Welsh. The producer was David Raven Allen.